Yesterday, Senator Bernie Sanders gave a speech at George Washington University. In it, he did two key things. First, he defined what democratic socialism means in his own words. This is a response to popular opposition talking points about the Democratic field leaning towards socialism, which Sanders sees as a scare tactic. The second thing Sanders did was introduce what he calls the 21st Century Economic Bill of Rights. We're going to cover that too, but first, let's talk about the democratic socialism part. So in case you haven't heard, Sanders is not a registered Democrat, though he is running to be the Democratic candidate for president. Technically, Sanders is an independent, and he self-identifies as a democratic socialist. But it's clear that he sees an issue with the general public's understanding of what the heck that means. So he held this speech yesterday to explain it. In the show notes, you will find a link to the entire video, as well as a link to the full text of his prepared remarks. Now, because the speech went on for 45 minutes, I'm going to be somewhat selective about what I focus on here. The first thing his speech did was lay out his view of the current situation in the US, and then he placed it in both a historical and global context. At one point, he made a particularly notable comparison between his own campaign platform and President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's effort to implement leftist proposals in order to build up the power and security of working people in America, aka the New Deal. I'm going to play a clip that starts about 15 minutes into Sanders' speech. Listen in.
Like today, the quest for transformative change was opposed by big business, by Wall Street, by the political establishment, by the Republican Party, and by the conservative wing of FDR's own Democratic Party. And he faced the same scare tactics then that we experience today: red baiting, xenophobia, racism, and anti-Semitism. In a famous 1936 campaign speech, Roosevelt stated, and I quote, "We had to struggle with the old enemies of peace: business and financial monopoly, speculation, reckless banking, class antagonism, sectionalism, war, profiteering." They had begun to consider the government of the United States as a mere appendage to their own affairs. We know now that government by organized money is just as dangerous as government by organized mob. And Roosevelt concluded, and I quote, "Never before in all our history have these forces been so united against one candidate as they stand today. They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred." That was FDR in 1936. Now, although it does sound, I must say it does sound a little contemporary, doesn't it? Despite that opposition, by rallying the American people, FDR and his progressive coalition created the New Deal, won 4 terms, and created an economy that worked for all and not just the few.
Then he launched into a detailed explanation of how, essentially, FDR's New Deal plan is a starting point for understanding what Sanders believes is democratic socialism. He also explained how, after the initial popularity and success of the New Deal, people on the right wing managed to regain control and weaken parts of it. Later in the speech, Sanders said, quote, "It is my very strong belief that the United States must reject that path of hatred and divisiveness, and instead find the moral conviction to choose a different path, a higher path, a path of compassion, justice, and love. It is the path that I call democratic socialism. Over 80 years ago, Franklin Delano Roosevelt helped create a government that made transformative progress in protecting the needs of working families. Today, in the second decade of the 21st century, we must take up the unfinished business of the New Deal and carry it to completion." End quote. Then, toward the very end of the speech, Sanders laid out his plan. He said, quote, "Today I am proposing a 21st century economic Bill of Rights. A Bill of Rights that establishes once and for all that every American, regardless of his or her income, is entitled to the right to a decent job that pays a living wage, the right to quality health care, the right to a complete education, the right to affordable housing, the right to a clean environment, the right to a secure retirement,